Bonjour, Waubgeshig Rice, Makwat no dem, Wasaksink non Jaba. Hi there, my name is Waubgeshig Rice. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe, and I'm from Wasaksink First Nation, which is on Georgian Bay near Parry Sound, Ontario. I currently live in Sudbury, Ontario, and I am joining you now from my backyard here in the city, and I am delighted to be a part of this storytelling event. So, Chmigwech, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this. It is a great honor. I am an author of 3 fiction titles, and I'm also a freelance journalist. I'm a former broadcast journalist, spent most of my career with CBC News, where I recently moved on from my job as the afternoon host here in Northern Ontario on the radio. After 14 years at CBC, I decided it was time to focus more on my literary storytelling endeavors and spending a little more time with my family and with my culture. Again, it is really great for me to be a part of this because it is an opportunity for me to reflect on how stories have really shaped me, how they've shaped my career, and really how they've provided me guidance for the path ahead. So I'm going to share a few Nanabush stories with you in a little bit, but first I wanted to give you a little bit of background on myself, who I am, where I'm from, and how I got into the career path that I did, and how learning about my Anishinaabe culture through stories really led me on this path and really helped me to stay with it and helped me to become proud of myself as an Anishinaabe and as a storyteller, essentially. So, as mentioned, I'm from a small Anishinaabe community called Wasaksing, which is a small reserve of about 400 people in the community. It's on an island that used to be predominantly known as Parry Island, but now it's more widely known by its traditional name of Wasaksing. And I grew up in the 1980s and the 1990s in a time when my people were essentially reconnecting with Anishinaabe culture. It was a very special time for me to be growing up because, I saw a lot of really exciting and interesting things happening around me. So to give you a little background of my community, it has endured some very traumatic events and losses throughout the course of its short history of being colonized. And one thing that's always important to remember is that a lot of different indigenous communities have endured colonization in different ways, and there have been some benefits, obviously, for many of them, but by far it's been a detrimental experience for a lot of these communities in losing culture and losing life and essentially losing land. And all of these things are intertwined in sort of that detrimental and negative and really tragic colonial process here on this land that we now call North America, that our people call Turtle Island. So our history goes back to time immemorial when the Anishinaabe of that part of Georgian Bay really traversed the northern shore of Georgian Bay and Lake Huron for centuries, for millennia, as far as we know. And they traveled according to the seasons, according to the food, according to what was available. And it was obviously a migratory way of being. But once the European settlers came in and started sort of imposing their will on our people, things really began to change. And for us, the bigger changes happened towards the latter half of the 19th century. And our community is a signatory to the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And that sort of vaguely determine some land boundaries and some habitations for different Anishinaabe groups of the time. So that was signed. It predated Confederation, obviously. And by the time Canada was confederated in 1867, the authorities began sort of interpreting the treaties in different ways and sort of imposing their will through the treaties in ways that more benefited the state than the Indigenous peoples that were signatories of these treaties. So what that meant for us was that when we traditionally traversed these lands, how the Robinson-Huron Treaty was interpreted was that we had to be confined to this island community that we now inhabit. And all this to say, I should have mentioned off the top, but I do have background in both indigenous and settler cultures. My father's Anishinaabe, and my mother is a Canadian, originally from Northern Ontario. So I come at this history through two different lenses, obviously, but because I was raised in my community and because I more closely identify with being Anishinaabe, that's sort of how I speak to it. But I also recognize and admire my family's heritage as settlers who really wanted to do good things by creating partnerships with Anishinaabe. So before I proceed, I just wanted to make sure that I pointed that out. So getting back to the history of Wasauksing, as the Robinson-Huron Treaty was enforced, that meant that my ancestors were confined to this island, and they were no longer allowed to freely move along the shores of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. And that had many negative impacts. That meant that they couldn't proceed with their traditional way of living, those traditional journeys, and they were confined to this land that was really unarable, whereas they performed different kinds of agriculture throughout their existence. They had a much more difficult time doing this on an island that was primarily a big rock, essentially. So while all this was happening, towards the mainland, where now the town of Parry Sound exists, which was the original settlement at the mouth of the Seguin River for the Anishinaabe that now live in Wasauksing, forestry was the main industry in the latter half of the 19th century. So that means a lot of the trees were cut down on the mainland, and whereas the Anishinaabe who now lived in Wasauksing, Parry Island, they would look to the mainland and see a lot of those trees being cut down. And it was from what I'm told, and my grandmother would tell me the story she heard through her grandparents in that generation, was that it was a traumatic experience to see the land being ravaged in that way. And while this was all happening, certain laws were being enacted. The Indian Act came into existence in 1876. And through that, that meant that culture was no longer allowed to be exercised in the community. There are all kinds of different clauses in the Indian Act that really confined and limited Indigenous people. And they couldn't leave, essentially, right? Many of us are familiar with the pass system. You needed permission from the Indian agent who worked on the reserve to leave the reserve to go elsewhere. So all these things were happening, and essentially the people in Wasauksing were led to believe their culture was shameful. They were led to believe that they were wrong, that they were evil. And as that shame internalized and really manifested in different traumatic ways, alcohol was introduced into the community. As mentioned, the culture was outlawed. There were no gatherings permitted, and so on. So this was a perpetuation of the end of their world. This was their apocalypse, as I mentioned. So as a result, the culture began to fade away. And then we're all very familiar with the residential school experience and what happened to different communities. Many children from our community were apprehended and put into the state-run residential schools. Fortunately, nobody from my immediate family was forced to go. And I think I'm thankful for that, because I've been able to be raised with my culture in many ways. So that perpetuated for generations, and there's a lot of really terrible things that happened in our community as a result of that. Alcohol abuse became prevalent. There was a very strong detachment from culture, and people died in many tragic ways, and there was a lot of violence. But by the time my generation was born and it started to grow up, my parents' generation and my parents and a lot of their peers decided that they wanted to raise their kids in an Anishinaabe way. They wanted to reconnect with some of those cultural elements and some of those traditional practices to ensure that we were able to grow up in a positive way and also understand who we were and where we came from. So as soon as I was, 4, 5, 6 years old, we started having powwows in our community again. We started having sweat lodges once again. Other ceremonies started to come in. The drum was reintroduced into the community, and we started learning the songs once again. And some of my earliest memories are part of this sort of reclamation and part of this revitalization. And again, I feel very fortunate that was my upbringing at this time, because that really instilled in me who I am as Anishinaabe and just how important it is to walk with this culture and allow it to inform me and influence me in my decisions as I grow up in this world. So, big part of that at the same time. And I tell you all this history because it's an important story for me to know, but also my peers, my relatives, my friends. We all have to understand where we came from to know where we're going next. And I think we have to understand the traumas that the previous generations went through and the sacrifices they made for us to ensure that we were raised in the latter half of the 20th century in a good way. So that's one crucial story I think we need to know. Like, history is all a big part of that, and it really informs who we are and really has set the foundation for people like me and having that connection to our culture and to our land especially. So a big part of that reclamation back in the 1980s was taking pride in stories once again and having elders share stories with children and having us understand our history through that medium. And in our community, the people who were my age were amongst that first cohort who were allowed to go beyond kindergarten in the community all the way up to grade 8. So prior to that, we had a kindergarten in our community, and then the kids would go to school in Parry Sound to finish the rest of their elementary and secondary schooling. But again, as part of this big reclamation and renaissance, the adults in our community lobbied the federal government for funding to allow us to expand our school. And as a result, they attached very important cultural elements to the curriculum when they made this pitch to have the school expanded in our community. So it was, I can only think back to how empowering of a moment that must have been. And again, how fortunate I was to grow up with that. So part of that meant whenever an elder came by, we would make time for them to share stories with us. And the school was on the main road of the community. And every so often, an elder would be walking by and then just stop in. And then we would stop whatever we were doing and go on the floor, and the elder would sit in a chair and share stories with us. And that was really important for me in putting all the pieces together and understanding what my culture really was, and really compelled me to learn about it and to want to really carry it on in many ways. So an elder would come into our class and would share stories about, our history, share some languages with us, some language lessons, also some Nanabush stories. Nanabush is a trickster figure of sorts in our culture. And he is responsible for the creation of a lot of things. And those were the most entertaining and in many ways the more amusing stories that we would hear from these elders. But that was a core part of our learning growing up in our community, having that storytelling element. And we always made time for it. Anytime an elder wanted to come by, the teacher would say, okay, so-and-so is here. It's time to sit down and listen. And we would sit and listen for however long we needed to, or however long the elder wanted us to listen for. And those are some of my fondest memories of learning about my culture, is having this story time with our elders. And that really, I think, for me, reminded me how important it is to hold on to these stories and to speak them for subsequent generations. And we remember them in different ways, and we tell them with different elements, and maybe some of the key figures in each of the stories may be a little different. But how we remember them is always the core messaging. There's always a moral to these stories, and there's a lesson to take away from them, even the funny Nanabush stories. So what I'll do is I'll share just a few short Nanabush stories with you, just to illustrate, some of the basic storytelling that I grew up with, but still informs me today. So the first story I'll tell you is Nanabush and the geese. And these are all creation stories. I should say we do have an epic creation story in Anishinaabe culture that explains how everything came to be. But that is a very long story. Apparently it takes, 4 to 5 days to hear it all. I have never heard the whole thing from start to finish. I have heard elements of it throughout my life, but I have not sat in the lodge to hear the whole thing. And that is my goal, to hear it someday. So obviously I do not have the knowledge or the authority to share that with you. So I will just say that singular creation story is a very powerful moment. It's a very powerful lesson, and it's I guess a really revered part of our culture that it exists in such an epic way, and you really do need to take the time for it to really understand it and to really be able to carry it forward. And it takes multiple listenings, from what I know. So I do know it. I know bits and pieces of it, but I don't know it all in its entirety, and thus I don't have the authority to tell our whole creation story. But we do have these Nanabush stories that are smaller creation stories. They explain how things came to be. And getting back to Nanabush and the geese, this is one of the funnier, but also maybe one of the more grim Nanabush stories. And I think at the core, it has to do with being prepared. It has to do with respecting other beings and respecting the seasons. And obviously, the underlying theme to all these stories really is understanding the land and having a good relationship with it and respecting it first and foremost. So with Nanabush, he was a very complicated figure. He obviously had great powers. He had great skills. But he was a little emotionally all over the place. You know, he was a little scattered here and there. He was a trickster, so he enjoyed playing tricks. He enjoyed doing interesting and funny things. But also, he was known to have a short temper at times. And he was known to be a little more egotistic in some ways. And the way he behaved himself on a more sort of narcissistic and selfish level always was meant to remind us to stay humble. So there are some of those core fundamental teachings that we're reminded of when we hear of these Nanabush stories. So Nanabush really liked the summer. It was his favorite time of the year. And we are in the sort of peak of summer at the moment. And many of us are trying our best to enjoy it, you know, despite the pandemic and the change to our everyday routines that the sickness has sort of prompted. We're still trying to find ways to enjoy ourselves, trying to find ways to relax. And that was Nanabush too. He was all about that. So he would spend time on the beach. He would go fishing. He would just relax. He slept a lot. He would go pick berries, and he would just enjoy the fruits of all that summer had to offer. So he was sort of just taking his time and not really taking the usual transition of the seasons seriously. And before he knew it, it was fall. The summer had totally gotten away from him, and fall was creeping up. The temperature was getting colder, the leaves were starting to fall off the trees, and he sort of came to one day and realized that he hadn't prepared anything for the coming winter. So he panicked a bit. He went out to his usual hunting spots and saw that a lot of the game he would have hunted was gone. A lot of the animals had migrated away, especially the birds. He went to his fishing spots and found that they had sort of were depleted already of their resources because other people were making preparations. He hadn't picked enough fruit, he hadn't picked enough medicines, and he was really behind the ball. So he was really unsure of what he was going to do in terms of trying to get ready for the coming winter. So he was sitting at his little shelter on the beach. He decided to stay there, and he didn't really know what he was going to do. He sort of started to panic a little bit. Then he heard this sort of ruckus out in the bush sort of emerge, and he wasn't sure what that was. It sounded like a party was going on. And he said, okay, you know, I thought everybody was gone for the winter. Maybe there's still some people around, you know, reveling in the season kind of thing. So he followed the noise back into the bush, and he found that there were a bunch of geese there sort of dancing around and having a party and just really enjoying themselves. And they were just sort of reveling in the season and in each other and just having a good time. So Nanabush walked up to one of them and sort of tapped him and said, hey, what's going on here? What are you guys doing? And the goose said, oh, hey, Nanabush, what's up? You know, we're just sort of getting ready to make our big migration south. So we're just having one last celebration here and asking for a good journey. And we're hoping we get off in a good way. And we're just, you know, celebrating the end of the season and our lives here. We're very thankful, and we're going to take up the next part of our lives as the year progresses, as we usually do, down south. So Nanabush said, okay. He's like, well, may I join you? And they said, yeah, of course. Come on, come back here, you know, dance around. We're having a good time. So Nanabush sort of stood there and surveyed all the geese there, and he counted about 30 to 40. There's a lot of geese. It would have been a flock in a flying V that was about to head out, right? So he's like, if I'm able to nab all these geese, that's going to be enough for me for a while. I'm going to be eating pretty good for a little bit. So he sort of devised and schemed and figured out a way to dupe them into becoming his food for the next little while. So he said, he went back to the group and he said, hey, can I make an announcement to the original goose? And the goose said, yeah, feel free, go ahead. So Nanabush went up. He said, excuse me, everybody, thank you for allowing me to join your celebration. I'm very humbled to be here. I'm Nanabush. Many of you know me. I just want to help send you off in a good way. And I want to offer a dance to you all to help you get off in a good way. And this is a dance I think will, give thanks for the life we have. And he sort of went off on this big long spiel about how this was going to be, a sacred dance or an important moment. But he was scheming. He had nefarious intentions behind this dance. So he said, okay, what I want you all to do is just close your eyes and just spin around in a circle. That's how I want this dance to go. So everybody do it. Everybody close your eyes and everybody start dancing around in a circle, twirl yourself around. So they all started doing it, and unbeknownst to them, he was going to go around and snap all their necks and kill them all. So the idea was to blind them and to make them a little dizzy if they did open their eyes and they were unable to sort of protect themselves. So one by one, Nanabush went through that whole group of a few dozen geese and killed them all. He snapped all their necks. And when he was done, he said, okay, well, here I am. I'm ready for the next little bit. This is my food. I'm good to go. So he hauled them all back to his camp, and he sort of stacked them all up, and he had a feast himself. He ate a few of them. He basically gorged himself until he fell asleep. But before he fell asleep, he said, okay, I'm getting a little, sleepy here. I've eaten good. I have enough food for the next little while. And he said to his butt, he said, okay, butt, I'm going to go sleep for a little bit. I want you to keep watch of all these geese here that I hunted, because that's our food for the next little while. So don't let anything happen to these geese. So Nanabush fell asleep, and he turned his butt to keep watch and fell asleep. So he woke up, and he looked around, and he noticed all the geese were gone. And he's like, what happened? And his butt had let him down, but, Nanabush, because he wasn't all there and maybe sometimes not that intelligent, didn't realize that his butt didn't have the sort of wherewithal to keep watch for him. So all the geese were gone. Some other predators had come and taken them all in the night, and Nanabush once again had no food for the upcoming winter. So he got really, really mad, and he said, I'm going to punish you, but you're going to pay for this. You were supposed to keep watch of all these geese, and now they're all gone, and now we're going to starve once again. So the fire was still going, and he went and put his butt in the fire to punish it. He set his butt on fire. So he obviously was not thinking it through and didn't realize that his butt was obviously part of his body and that this was going to hurt him if this happened. So after a minute or so of burning his butt, he started to feel the pain and then realized, oh no, I'm setting myself on fire. So what he did was he jumped down the rocks that were on the shore of the lake there. And he sort of skidded his butt down to put the fire out. And he put it all out and then jumped in the water. And then he sort of got on with the next part of his sort of preparation. But what's left there, when we go to the lake and we see the rocks along the shoreline, and we see the lichen on the lakes, that's the result of the scabbing that came off of Nanabush's butt when he tried to put out the fire as he was sliding down the rock. So that lichen is always supposed to remind us of his mess up. Nanabush screwed up really bad when he didn't get ready for the winter. He tricked all these geese and killed them all. He wasn't operating like a good person. He was being exploitative of the land and of the creatures around him. So that's what that lichen is supposed to remind us as Anishinaabe when we see that. And that's sort of it's a funny story at points, but it's also grim, as I mentioned. But the whole idea is to just teach us about being prepared and making sure that we know how to live in a good way as Anishinaabe on the land around us. So it is starting to rain as I'm recording this, so I'm going to have to cut it short. I was going to tell you one more story about Nanabush and the bees and how they got their stingers, but essentially, just the Coles Notes version of that is the bees were being exploited by the other animals and bears around them, but they went to Nanabush and asked for defense. And the reason they got the stingers was because they put up a unified front. They were very respectful, and they wanted to make sure that they had protection, and Nanabush granted that to them. So that's the really quick Coles Notes version of that. I apologize to have to cut this short. I just wanted to say Chimigwesh for this opportunity. My name is Waubgeshig Rice. This has been a very fun event to be a part of virtually, and I hope you all have a good remainder of the summer, and all the best. Take care.